The wind hits first, then the cold. 30 degrees below zero, sweeping flat across land with no trees and no hills to break it. Somewhere out on that frozen grass sits a single tent made of animal hide. You already know what you think happens next. A thin skin wall, a small fire, people gritting their teeth through the night, surviving on toughness alone until spring comes to save them. That is not what happened. Inside that tent, while the storm outside dropped past -30, the air stayed close to room temperature. Not because the people inside were tougher than us, because the tent was not a tent at all. It was a machine. A tilted cone built so precisely that the wind's own force pushed the structure down into the ground instead of tearing it loose, wrapped around a second inner wall that pulled cold air in low and pushed smoke out high. The same chimney effect engineers still rely on today. And here is the part almost nobody tells you. The people who designed this, who owned it, who built it with their own hands, were women. A Hidatsa woman named Wahini described this life herself, and what she described was not luck. It was architecture. Some of her people did not even live in tents at all. They built entire domed homes out of timber and packed earth, sunk into the ground, large enough to hold 40 people, insulated so well that the coldest hour of the night outside would not even reach the people sleeping inside until the following afternoon. By the time we are done tonight, you will understand how a tilted cone of hide turns the plane's worst windstorms into a downward anchor instead of a threat. You will meet the women who engineered these homes. You will step inside a lodge the size of a house, with a domed roof built to mirror the sky itself. This did not just keep people alive. It was one of the most complete engineering systems ever built, from nothing but wood, hide, grass, and earth. Chapter 1. The tilted machine. Picture the frame first. 15 to 20 lodgepole pine poles, each one 20 to 25 feet long, peeled clean and rubbed smooth so no rough bark could tear the hide skin stretched over them. 3 of those poles went up first, lashed together at the top with rawhide rope, planted at exact points, one toward the southeast to frame the doorway, the others north and south. Every pole after that locked into the same spiral, distributing the weight evenly around the frame. Over that frame went the cover itself, 8 to 15 buffalo hides stitched together, taken from animals killed in autumn when their coats had grown thickest for the coming winter. Each hide was scraped clean of flesh, worked soft with brain and marrow until it could bend without cracking, then held over a smoky fire until the whole cover darkened to a deep, weathered color. That smoking step was not decoration. It changed the hide at a chemical level, sealing the fibers so melting snow could not soak in and rot the material from the inside out. The same way good leather gets treated before a long winter today. Now look closer at the shape. A summer teepee stands almost like a straight cone, tall and even on every side. A winter teepee does not. It leans. The back wall, facing northwest, into the direction the worst winter wind would come from, was pulled in steep and tight. The front, facing away from the wind, stayed long and low. That was not an accident, and it was not decoration. When a blizzard wind slammed into that steep back wall, the tilt caught the force and redirected it downward, driving the whole structure into the earth instead of lifting it. The harder the wind pushed, the harder the teepee held. The base mattered just as much as the shape. In summer, the cover was lifted off the ground to let air flow underneath. In winter, that gap disappeared. Wooden pegs, driven in every 15 to 25 centimeters, pinned the hide flush to the frozen ground. Where the earth was too hard or too rocky for pegs, families lashed stones into the hide's lower edge instead. Snow was packed against that base too, but never touching the hide itself. Direct contact meant rot. A careful gap was left. Then the snowbank was built up around it, turning the base of the home into its own small wall of ice. None of that would have mattered without what happened on the inside. A second wall, called an ozon, hung from a rope circling the poles about 7 feet up and dropped straight down to the floor. The outer cover's edge stayed lifted just slightly off the ground. That narrow gap let cold air slip in low, but it never reached the people inside. It rose instead, trapped in the space between the outer hide and the inner liner, warming as it climbed past the fire, until it escaped through the smoke hole at the very top. 2 flaps up there, worked by long poles from outside, could be turned to catch or block the wind, keeping that draft steady no matter which way the storm was blowing. The difference this made was not small. A single layer of hide alone barely slowed the cold down at all, changing temperature almost as fast inside as out. Add that second wall, and the trapped air gap behind it, and the same hide envelope held its warmth roughly 7 times longer before the cold outside ever caught up with it. That narrow ring of trapped air worked exactly like a coat with a lining sewn into it. It did not need to be thick. It only needed to trap stillness. And by trapping it, a home made from stretched animal skin held its air close to 60 or 70 degrees Fahrenheit, while the storm outside dropped to 30 below zero. That same trick of trapping still air worked on the body too. Winter robes came from buffalo killed between November and March, when the fur ran thickest, worked soft and smoked just like the teepee cover itself. Worn with the fur facing inward against the skin, that fur held a layer of warm air right against the body, while the tougher outer side shed snow instead of soaking it up. Add a second, lighter robe underneath a heavier outer one, and a person carried 2 separate pockets of trapped air stacked on top of each other. Dressed like that, someone could work outside for hours in cold that would put an unprepared person in real danger within minutes. That was the teepee. A cone shaped to fight the wind, a hidden second wall that turned a single fire into central heating, and clothing built on the exact same principle. But not every Plains family lived in one. Some built something much stranger and much bigger, buried straight into the ground itself. Chapter 2. The architects were women ask who built these homes, and most people guess wrong. It was women. Among the river valley nations and among many of the nomadic plains peoples too, the teepee and the earth lodge were not built by men and handed to their families. Women owned them outright. Women planned them, harvested the timber, tanned the hides, and stitched every seam with sinew thread and bone needles. A tripod frame lashed at the top with rawhide, then locked pole by pole into a spiral, was engineering work, and it belonged to them. Among the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and the Arikara, that ownership went even deeper. These were matrilineal societies. Clan membership passed from mother to daughter. Farming fields passed from mother to daughter. And so did the home itself. When a man married, he did not bring his wife into his household. He moved into hers, into a lodge built and owned by women, under the authority of the senior woman of that family line. A grandmother passed her lodge down to her daughter, who would one day pass it to hers, an unbroken chain of ownership running through generations of women. Building one of these homes was not a solo effort either. A senior woman planned the project, chose where to harvest timber, and called on her female relatives to help raise it. Because the 4 central posts of an earth lodge carried such deep ceremonial weight, families hired women with specific ritual knowledge to direct that part of the work and speak the proper words over it as it rose. The women who helped were paid for their labor too, with dried bison meat, corn balls, and finely decorated clothing. One of the clearest windows into this life comes from a Hidatsa woman named Wahini, also known as Buffalo Bird Woman, who lived through most of this way of life herself before it changed forever. Late in her life, she described walking into the timber with her dogs to find and season fallen cottonwood trees for beams and posts. She explained why villages needed to keep rebuilding. Cottonwood logs rot. A finished earth lodge lasted only 7 to 10 years before it needed to come down and go up again, somewhere new, planned again by women who understood exactly what that new home would need to survive. That kind of ownership meant something more than who got the credit. It meant the exact knowledge of where to site a lodge for warmth, how thick the insulating layers needed to be, and how long a set of cottonwood posts could be trusted before they had to be replaced. Stayed inside a direct female line, tested and refined instead of lost and relearned by every new generation. This was not a side detail in Plains life. It was the structure underneath everything else. The homes that kept entire families alive through the worst winters on the continent existed because women engineered them, owned them, and passed that knowledge down like an inheritance. And some of what they built went far beyond anything made of hide and poles. Chapter 3: The Village Hidden in the Valley. Not every Plains family lived in a tent, even in the coldest months. Along the Missouri and Platte River valleys, nations like the Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara, Pawnee, Omaha, Oto, and Ponca built something that looked less like a shelter and more like a small hill. The earth lodge started as a hole. Builders dug a circular pit 1 to 3 feet into the ground, dropping the living floor below the frost line before a single pole went up. 4 massive forked cottonwood posts, each 10 to 15 inches thick, were raised in a square around the center of that pit and locked together with heavy horizontal beams. A ring of 10 to 18 shorter posts went up around the outer edge, and long rafters stretched from that outer ring back to the central square, leaving one open gap at the very top, a combined skylight and smoke vent 3 to 4 feet across. Then came the layers. A tight woven mat of willow branches covered the rafters first. On top of that went thick bundles of dried prairie grass, packed in for insulation, and over all of it, builders piled packed sod, clay, and grass roots, 1.5 to 2 feet deep. The finished structure could stretch 30 to 60 feet across, with some ceremonial lodges reaching 90, tall enough and strong enough to shelter 20 to 40 people at once, along with their horses. Life inside that shell was arranged with its own logic. Horses, among a family's most valuable possessions, were stabled right inside the lodge along one section of the wall, close enough to add their own body heat to the room. Around the rest of the perimeter stood raised sleeping platforms enclosed in hide curtains, small private pockets that held a sleeper's own warmth in overnight. The oldest members of the household were given the beds closest to the fire, where the heat reached first and stayed longest. That much packed earth does something no hide wall ever could. It holds heat and cold for a very long time before either one moves through it. Engineers call this thermal lag, and for an earth lodge roof, that lag runs to roughly 16 hours. The coldest point of a Plains winter night usually falls right around 5 in the morning. In an earth lodge, that same cold does not reach the living space until well into the following afternoon, long after the family inside has already rebuilt the fire and gone about their day. The home was, in effect, running many hours behind the weather outside it, and that delay alone could mean the difference between a bearable morning and a dangerous one. None of this was permanent, though. Cottonwood rots, and a lodge lasted only 7 to 10 years before it had to be rebuilt somewhere new. Even within a single year, families moved. Summers were spent on high bluff terraces above the river, catching the breeze and staying clear of floodwater. But late in the fall, entire villages relocated into heavily timbered river bottoms, building smaller winter earth lodges, or raising their teepees, tucked inside dense cottonwood groves that blocked the worst of the prairie wind and kept firewood and water within easy reach. A home the size of a small hill, timed 16 hours behind the weather trying to kill it, and even that was not the strangest part of how it was built. Chapter 4. The details that kept them alive. Getting into an earth lodge safely took more than just walking through a door. Builders attached a long entry tunnel, 6 to 15 feet long and 5 to 6 feet tall, angled toward the east or south, away from the direction winter storms usually came from. That tunnel did real work. Cold air is heavier than warm air, so instead of rushing straight into the living space, it settled and pooled along the sloped tunnel floor. A heavy hide curtain sealed the outer end, and a solid wooden or rawhide door, hung on thong hinges, sealed the inner end, creating a pocket of still, trapped air between the two, an airlock in every sense of the word. Just past that, where the tunnel opened into the main room, builders set up a large wood or hide screen to catch whatever cold air did slip through and steer it around the outer wall instead of straight toward the fire. None of this happened in isolation either. Entire camps of teepees were set up in a circle, every doorway facing east, turned away from the wind that hit hardest from the west and northwest. Packed close together like that, the ring of hides itself became a windbreak for the whole camp, cutting the worst of the gusts before a single one of them reached an individual home. Inside each of those homes, 8 to 10 people lived through the winter together, sharing the warmth of one small fire and each other's bodies inside a shelter built to make the most of both. Keeping that fire alive took its own kind of planning. Wood was scarce out on open grassland, so dried buffalo chips became the main fuel, burning hotter than most people expect. Women and children spent the last weeks of autumn gathering them by the load, along with tightly twisted bundles of dried grass that burned slow and steady, almost like a manufactured log. At night, stones were heated in the coals until they glowed, wrapped in hide, and buried beneath the sleeping areas, releasing steady warmth for hours after the fire had died down. And when it was time to move camp, nobody wanted to start a fire from nothing in the freezing cold. So the coals themselves traveled. Packed inside hollow buffalo horns, sealed shut with clay, a fire could survive for days on the road, ready to be woken up again the moment a family reached their next camp. Food followed the same careful logic. Meat was dried, pounded into powder, and mixed with rendered fat and berries into pemmican, a single pound carrying about 3,500 calories. It was carried in rawhide parfleches hung from the lodge poles, safe from moisture and pests. Vegetables went underground instead, into cache pits lined with bark, where the frozen earth itself acted as a natural freezer, keeping food edible for months. An airlock at the door. A whole camp arranged to block the wind before it reached a single home. A fire that traveled sealed inside an animal horn. Food buried in the frozen ground on purpose. None of it looked impressive from the outside. All of it was the difference between a family that made it to spring and one that did not. Chapter 5. A ceiling built to mirror the sky. Step back and look at an Earth lodge from above, and it starts to look less like a building and more like a diagram. For the Skidi Pawnee, that was exactly the point. The circular floor represented the Earth itself. The dome rising above it represented the vault of the sky, the home of Tirawa, the creator. The entry corridor was built facing east, toward the rising sun and the morning star, the direction associated with light and the beginning of life. Directly across the room from that entrance stood a shrine, positioned beneath the symbolic domain of the evening star, holding sacred bundles and bison skulls. Walking through an earth lodge meant walking along a spiritual line stretched across the entire structure, sunrise to sunset, life entering on one side, sacred memory held on the other. The 4 central posts carried this even further. Each one stood for one of 4 stars believed to hold up the sky itself, and each was cut from a specific wood and painted a specific color to match. The northwest post, cut from box elder and painted yellow, stood for the yellow star and the autumn winds. The southwest post, cottonwood and white, stood for the white star and the spring rains. The northeast post, elm and black, stood for the big black star, night, wisdom, and winter thunder. The southeast post, willow and red, stood for the red star, summer lightning, and war. 4 trees, 4 colors, 4 directions, holding up one roof, and that roof did more than shelter. The open gap at its very top, the same aperture that let smoke escape, doubled as a window straight up into the night sky. Village priests used it as a fixed observation point, watching stars like the Big Dipper and Corona Borealis pass across that opening in line with the 4 center posts below. By tracking exactly when and where those stars crossed the gap, priests could mark the turning points of the year, when to plant, when to hold ceremonies, when the season was about to change. That knowledge did not live only in memory. In 1902, inside a sacred bundle, an anthropologist named James Murray found a chart painted on tanned elk skin, recording the winter and summer constellations split by the Milky Way. It had been used for generations as a memory aid, a way for priests to check what they saw through the smoke hole against what had been recorded by those who came before them. A home built from dirt, grass, and cottonwood logs, engineered against the worst cold on the continent, and at the same time built to hold the entire sky above the people sleeping inside it. That was never just a shelter. It was a working model of the universe they lived in.